I've got a title for today's message, and we're going to simply call it A Wake-Up Call in the Wasteland. A wake-up call in the wasteland. And I'm glad that Daniel kind of did do his recap, because it's really going to be like part 2 of last week's introductory sermon. If you were here last week, hopefully you can recall, and some of you could recall, the background that we gave. The first 5 verses of the book begins with a family who experienced nothing but tragedy upon tragedy for a period of around 10 years. First, starts with a famine in the land that they were living in. Remember, there was no bread in Bethlehem, the house of bread. Now, the famine, though, it wasn't the family's fault. It was, in fact, the nation of Israel as a whole who were to blame. Why? For turning their backs on God, and now they're suffering the consequences of that rebellion. There's famine in the land. But we saw last week there is something that this family can be held accountable for, perhaps even especially Elimelech, the father, the husband, the one who was supposed to be the leader of this home. It was his fault, the decision to leave the promised land. Remember, this was a Hebrew family. And so as God-fearing Jews, they should never have left the promised land, let alone for a place like Moab, a place synonymous with corruption, rebellion, compromise, a place that was heavily into the worship of false gods. And then what happened next, as we focused on last week, what we see next are the painful consequences of what this rebellious decision to start a new life in Moab looked like. We saw those consequences because not long after arriving in this foreign place, we read of the unexpected deaths of not only Elimelech, but of their 2 sons. That's where we left off. We left off kind of feeling the weight of Naomi's grief. She left her home full, husband and sons, hope for a better future, but now she's empty, widowed, childless, and destitute. But then we get to verse 6. Finally we get the first bit of positive news since the story has first started. But also starting in verse 6, we get the first time that God is going to be mentioned in the book. And you know what? As simple as this may sound, perhaps this is the first lesson to take away this morning. And this first lesson, how about I give it to you in a form of a question? What would your life look like if you started every decision with God, instead of turning to Him only after things fall apart? You see, because here in this story, it's only when God is brought into the equation that we now get a glimmer of hope. We get a glimmer of hope in what was this very bleak and dark situation that Naomi found herself in. But what if God had been brought into the equation 10 years ago? What then? What if Elimelech had brought God and the promises of God and the law of God into his decision making while still in the promised land? What then? In other words, what would life have looked like for Elimelech and Naomi and their sons if Elimelech had started his every decision with God instead of doing what was right in his own eyes? We're left with the question, aren't we? Could they have avoided all of this grief and pain and heartache? Now, I know these are like hypothetical questions, but as we get to verse 6 now, I want you to notice. I want you to notice whether or not we get an answer to these hypothetical questions. And you know what? I believe we do. See, look at verse 6 now. We're told that she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. In other words, it was just a matter of time, wasn't it? It was just a matter of time because of the love of God, the nature of God, the grace, the character of God. It was just a matter of time until he would once again show his grace and mercy and would restore his blessing upon his people. So I don't know about you, but I read a verse like that and I'm like, Elimelech, the food was coming. And you should have known that. If only you would have trusted in God, your God, the same God, Elimelech, that you knew the way in which he delivered your people out of Egypt all those years ago. The same God you knew the way in which he provided for them time and time again during those 40 years of wandering around in the wilderness. And Elimelech, either your parents or your grandparents, surely they would have told you about this cycle of sin and the judges that they were going through. That this wasn't the first time that God was punishing his people for their disobedience, but then was moved by compassion and then restores their blessing. And so Elimelech, if only you wouldn't have taken matters into your own hands and done what was right in your own eyes, well then maybe you didn't have to put your family through all of this tragedy. And you know what? Just to further highlight this point and to show that in fact, we do think that tragedy could have been avoided. Let me show you one more verse, down further, down in verse 19. When they came to Bethlehem, like when we're jumping the gun, but when Naomi finally returns, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" No, I'm getting ahead of myself here, but here's one thing this verse I think is showing us. Doesn't seem like many people died from the famine, at least not in that town. In fact, it says the whole town was stirred, and most likely the whole town was stirred because the whole town, they recognized Naomi, which means that not only was the whole town there and around back then before she left to Moab, but more importantly, they're still around 10 years later post-famine. Or to put even more simply than that, the people of that town, they decided to trust God and stay, and they survived and were now reaping the blessings of God. And so we're left wondering, what if Elimelech had decided to do the same? To trust God and stay? Could he have avoided putting his family through all of this suffering? Please hear this, though, in saying all of that. I'm not bringing all of this up because we wish the story had gone any differently. No. Okay? Because as we're going to see, in God's providence, it needed to play out this way. And God will end up redeeming all of this tragedy, and he'll turn it into this incredible story of hope. But I do think there's a hard and honest question that we need to ask ourselves here, especially perhaps for those of us who do need to make big decisions. Perhaps those of us leading families. Perhaps those of us who are setting the direction. Perhaps us dads who are wanting to model to our children what it looks like to put God first. How many tragedies? How much pain? How many unnecessary detours and regrets in life could be avoided if we simply brought God into the picture from the start? Not as a last resort, not just when we're stuck, not just when we've run out of options, but right at the beginning, right? When the famine first hits, when fear first shows up, when the path seems unclear. Because the thing is, and I believe this is why we get Elimelech's story right here at the beginning. The thing is, when you leave God out, you might end up in Moab. You might end up losing way more than you ever expected to lose. But when you trust God and stay, within those boundaries of God's will for your life, even when it's hard, even when there's famine, even when it looks like nothing is working, well, you know this. He always proves himself to be faithful, doesn't he? We have a God who always comes good on his promises. The famine will end and the blessings will be restored. It's just that sadly, Elimelech didn't wait long enough to find that out. And so the encouragement that Elimelech's example leaves us with is this. Imagine if we started every decision by seeking God, by acknowledging God, even before the decision is made, right? Before the job is accepted, before the big move is made, before you decide to maybe respond in anger, before perhaps even deciding on the person you are going to date or even marry, so that you don't end up choosing a path that later ends up with grief and regrets. Because the tragedy of Elimelech's story, it's not just what ends up happening, is it? It's what might not have happened. What could have been avoided if only he had started with God. If only he had filtered all of his decisions through the Word of God. You know, there's a proverb, well-known proverb in the Bible that I think kind of summarizes this idea beautifully. It's a well-known one, Proverbs 3, verses 5 and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding. Do not do what is right in your own eyes, in your own wisdom. Instead, in all your ways, acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. I reckon some of us read that and we think, that's just hyperbole, isn't it? I mean, really, does God really want me to acknowledge him in all my ways? To some, it might seem silly or unnecessary or even a waste of time. And you might even think, does God really care? Like what I wear today or what I listen to or whether I purchase this one thing. Does he really care about all that? Well, if we're going to take his word seriously, the answer is, well, yes, he does. Simply because of that one word, all. God's will and his desire for our lives is for us to go to him, to bring him in, to acknowledge him in all of our ways, not just in the big things, but in the little things. Not just in the quote unquote spiritual things, but in the everyday things as well. How's that for a challenge to leave you with this week? How about we try that just for this 1 week, and then we'll check back to see what the results were. Before any decision you make this week, any action you take, whether it is something like what you choose to listen to or what you choose to watch or whether it is something like deciding, should I go to church this week? Should I go to Bible study this week? Perhaps before having that conversation or before blowing up at your child or yelling at your parents, why not before you just take a moment, a quick moment, to acknowledge God in that thing, in that moment? How? Could be a micro prayer of just asking for some quick guidance. Could be a quick mental scan of some Bible verse that speaks into that action or decision that you're about to make. Could be just a quick second to pause and ask, what would Jesus do in this moment? How would Jesus respond to this person who just spoke to me in this way, who just hurt me in this way? In other words, put simply, in all your ways, acknowledge him, and then wait and see what the results are. And you know what I think is going to happen? I want you to notice whether or not your paths or your life, if they're any straighter this week and more in line with God's will for you. Why? Because you decided to acknowledge him in everything instead of leaning on your own understanding, leaning on your own wisdom. Now again, sadly, Elimelech didn't take on this challenge, but instead he did lean on his own understanding. And because of that, Naomi is now stuck in Moab. Naomi's stuck in Moab. The good news though, and we're getting to this, she's not going to be stuck there for much longer, is she? Because as we come back to verse 6 again, we're going to see in Naomi a resolve to return. A resolve to return. She may have been stuck in Moab, and again, perhaps out of no fault of her own. But she refuses to stay down. So she gets up and she does something about her situation. Verse 6 again. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way and they returned to the land of Judah. I wonder if this morning perhaps someone here can relate to what Naomi is going through. And I don't necessarily mean like all of the pain and tragedy that she's had to go through. Instead, what I mean is maybe you can relate to what it feels like to live in Moab. Maybe some of us find ourselves in a spiritual Moab today. We didn't necessarily mean to walk away from God. It seems like we just drifted. But then we settled. And then we got comfortable. Perhaps we even married into Moab or established some relationships that are going to be hard to leave. I mean, at first, we thought just a little distance from the promise, just a little distance from God, that wouldn't hurt. But then the losses begin to stack up and we realize that we're in a place that we were never meant to be in, let alone remain and stay in. And if that's any of us here this morning, if that's anyone here this morning, if Elimelech taught us how someone ends up drifting away from God's blessing, and so he teaches us what not to do, well, I believe that Naomi here teaches us what we can do in order to make our way back home to God. And what I want us to notice is that what she does is actually something quite simple, scary, but actually quite simple. Simple in that what she did was she simply resolved to get up and make her way. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return. Verse 7, she set out from the place where she was in order to return to the land of Judah. Perhaps any other, remember she's an elderly lady by this stage. Perhaps any other elderly widow would have given up by now, but not Naomi. This is a strong woman with some serious determination and resolve. And did you notice what gets her moving? I love what gets her going, what gets her up, what gets her moving. It's not an angel. It's not a voice from heaven. It's not a dream or some prophetic vision. Instead, we're told that she simply heard something in the fields of Moab. We're not told much or anything about like where she heard it from, who she heard it from, except that it's out in the fields of Moab. The fact that she's out in the fields probably suggests that she's an elderly woman, but she's out working as a way to simply survive as a widow in a foreign land because she's got no one to look after her. Again, a strong woman with some serious determination and resolve. And now, as you can imagine, like with anyone's work environment, news and gossip can spread quite easily among the workers. We don't know where the news came from. Maybe someone had heard it while out in the marketplace. Maybe someone had visited from Bethlehem. Maybe some traveling merchants had traveled like from Bethlehem. They're now in Moab. We just don't know. And even though we don't know how she gets the news, that's not what's important. What's important is the news that she does receive. There's food back home again. The bread's been restocked in Bethlehem, the house of bread. And I love this point because, again, it's just another picture that we get from the book of Ruth, where God is using the most ordinary of means, a rumor, a conversation, perhaps news from a traveler. But he's just using some ordinary means to get Naomi's attention. And he gets her attention so that not only would her heart be comforted again with some hope of a future, he gets her attention so that she'd do something about it, so that she would rise and get moving again. It's another great lesson that we take from this story. Because there may be someone here today who perhaps feel like they're in a spiritual Moab. You're feeling distance from God's presence. You've been going through some spiritual drought. Maybe you're just stuck in survival mode. And if that's you, I wonder how God might be trying to get your attention. How could he be getting your attention today? Like Naomi, who received a wake-up call in the wasteland, I wonder how God might be wanting to get you moving again. Perhaps it's going to be, or it has been, a text message from a friend. Maybe it is a conversation that just struck a nerve. Maybe it's a sermon that resonated with you and just kind of stayed with you longer than usual. Maybe it's a song that kind of just spoke straight into your soul. Or maybe it is some pain or some hardship that's left you shaken, and that's what God is using to get your attention. Whatever it may be, the point is, and the takeaway from Naomi's story is, don't ignore it. Don't ignore it. Instead, do what Naomi did. Get up and take that first step. Whatever step, just take it deep down. I know you know what step that is for you, but take that first step on your journey back home to God. For Naomi, it was finally going back home to Bethlehem. For us, it might be picking up your Bible again. For us, it might be praying again, coming to church regularly again, reaching out to someone and saying, hey, I need help. Whatever it is. Naomi's story is this: don't ignore it. Do something. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck in Moab. Will the journey back home be easy? Not necessarily. There's no guarantees. I mean, just think about what it must have been like for Naomi. Think about the reservations she must have had in going back home, the fears in going back home that could have held her back from starting that journey back home. Remember, she left Bethlehem with her husband, with sons, a life that was full. But now she would be returning empty-handed, a widow, childless, and not only that, with a foreign Moabite daughter-in-law by her side. I imagine she would have feared. Maybe she would have feared being seen as a failure. Maybe judged by her community for not trusting in God, for not staying. And yet by faith, we see that she resolves in her heart to make it back home. You know why and you know how? Because more important than how others would perceive her, more important than that, was her desire to be back in the center of God's blessing and back in the center of God's will. That was more important than whatever others were going to think of her. What a wonderful picture of faith. Yes, the past has been painful, the future looks uncertain, and we simply don't know what God is going to do with my experience. But here's what we do know. We do know that Moab, which is symbolic of us living outside of God's will, well, we know that Moab has nothing to offer me except heartache and grief and disappointment. And so therefore I will get up and I will seek to be close to God again so that I can return to the center of his blessing, to the place of spiritual flourishing once again. I love this point. Amongst the many lessons that we can take from this story so far, I reckon this is one of the main ones. Naomi's story is a story of second chances. A story that is supposed to remind us, perhaps remind someone here this morning, no matter how far you've wandered, no matter how far you've drifted away, God's grace and his mercy, it's always calling us home. Which is why Naomi's story has been compared to, and maybe this is where Daniel was right. I did mention the prodigal daughter sometime last week. But her story has been compared to that of the prodigal son. Because we do see some similarities, not only in how they left, but also in how they return. You see, the prodigal son, remember, he asked for his inheritance so that he could leave his country full, off to a foreign country. In the same way, Naomi leaves her home seeking provision in a foreign land. And like the prodigal, she too leaves full, husband, family, hope for a future, but then also like the prodigal who squandered his inheritance in that far country, well, Naomi too experiences just loss after loss after loss and is left with nothing. And now both of them find themselves hungry, humiliated, and far from the abundance that can be found at the Father's house. Both Naomi and the prodigal, they hit rock bottom while far away from the Father's house, realizing that what they sought outside of the Father's will, everything they sought had actually left them empty. In fact, Naomi uses this same wording down in verse 21. She herself says, I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Both Naomi and the prodigal come back broken, humiliated, and grieving. But the point is, they both come back. And they come back because they both had what we might call this came to himself kind of moment. We get that phrase from Luke 15, the prodigal story. We're told that when he came to himself, he said, I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven, and I have sinned against you. Both are out in the fields when God gets their attention. One's with the pigs, Naomi's with her co-workers, but both, while in the fields, experience this came to himself kind of moment. Both experience this moment of clarity. And they come to the realization that they had sinned against heaven by looking for provision and fulfillment and satisfaction outside of God. And then did you notice what the prodigal does next after he comes to himself? His very first step back home. I will arise, he says, just like Naomi did. She arose and she started making her way back home. They both resolved to be back with their fathers. And when they make it back, well, you know how the story goes with the prodigal. The father runs to meet his son, wraps him in a robe, and throws on a feast. And now with Naomi, even though she may not receive a feast just yet, but her return sets in motion a plan that God has been working this whole time behind the scenes, preparing the fields of Boaz and setting up a story of redemption that I'm sure Naomi couldn't have even imagined. And I think that's one of the main takeaways from today's message as well. The God who visited Bethlehem all those years ago is the same God who still visits broken people today. He is the same God who runs to meet his children whenever they return, wrapping them in his finest robe, the Lord Jesus Christ. And then he throws on a feast and a celebration whenever one of his own returns and resolves to come back home. I wonder if a message like this one today is God wanting to get your attention again. Maybe he's trying to get your attention for you to finally make that resolve to come back home and into the arms of a waiting Heavenly Father. As I was thinking about this story, and sorry, Paul, I'm going off script. I know I shouldn't. I always get myself in trouble when I do that. But I was lying in bed this morning, just kind of soaking in this message. And then it kind of hit me why I think I was stuck here in these verses and why it hit home and it resonated the way it did. It's because Maru and I, we were stuck in Moab during our time in Argentina. Remember, we got married, we met at Bible college, we were ready to take on the world with ministry and serving, and then life happened. You don't wake up as a leader, as a father, as the husband of home. You don't wake up one morning and you decide, I'm going to stop taking my family to church. But one bad decision after a bad decision had us drifting very far away from what we might call our promised land in the moment, the place that we know God called us to, a life of serving him together. Fast forward around 5 years into our marriage, and we're very far from that. We drifted. We were in a spiritual Moab, and it was dry. There was drought. There was spiritual famine. And that, like Elimelech, that was on me. And then he gets my attention. And I remember this conversation vividly like it happened yesterday. Because here's the thing. We were still having people over all the time. We were meeting with friends. We were, as often happens to some of us Christians, we were still making the appearance that everything was fine and showing people that. So we had this couple. This was Maru's, one of her best friends growing up. Her and her husband were over for dinner. And we're talking about a whole bunch of things. She was a science teacher, biology teacher. And so we just go at it hard for that whole meal around evolution. And we're arguing, and I'm being argumentative and quite ungracious and really not making Christ look attractive at all. And you know what? She pulls me up on it. In the middle of that conversation and that dinner, she says, Roy, what happened to you? I'll have to ask Maru and see if she remembers it this way. But this is how I remember it, and I vividly can hear God getting my attention. She's like, Roy, what happened to you? I remember what you were like back when you first got married and you guys were leading in the church there. But now what happened to you? You're proud and you're arrogant and you're talking this way, and the way you've been treating Maru. That was God getting my attention, using this. She's not a Christian, still to this day. But God using that conversation to not only get my attention, but I believe that set in motion the series of events that got us back home. That got us back home. That was a moment of, that was my came to himself kind of moment. You might even call it the repentance that was needed to make the journey back home. So I bring all of that up because that really now just gets us up to verse 8, which we're going to hit next week. And we'll finally get introduced to Ruth and more of her story. But for now, let me just leave you again with some of those questions that we've been left with so far. What would your life look like if you started every decision with God instead of turning to him only after things fall apart? But then also, if you are in a spiritual Moab at the moment, how might God be trying to get your attention in order to get you moving again and to get you home?